Hey everyone, welcome back to our final unit from Thinking, Language, and Intelligence. We're wrapping up intelligence by talking about genetic and environmental influences. Okay, so let's talk about genetic and environmental influences to intelligence. So, studies have been conducted that compare the IQs of individuals who are genetically related based on their varied genetic relatedness. So the most important comparison that I want to talk about is comparing identical and fraternal twins. So you can see here that we have our identical twins, the Olsen twins, and here up top we have our fraternal twins. Apparently Vin Diesel has a twin brother, which is something I learned today. So what happens if we compare these two things, or why would we want to compare these two populations? Well, identical twins share exactly the same genes because they develop from a single fertilized egg that splits. So we can talk about the dissimilarities between them as being attributed to environmental factors, right? This is especially useful if we have twins that are separated at birth, right? Not very common, but useful, right? We can infer that the differences between the intelligence, or whatever it is we're measuring in the identical twins, is largely going to be influenced by their environment because they share the same genetic makeup. Fraternal twins are a lot like any other pair of siblings because they develop from two different fertilized eggs. So they don't share identical genetic material. They share many genetic similarities, but they're not identical. They often have similar environmental contributions, right? They're raised in the same household at the same time. So this lets us sort of compare how much the environment influences, because the genetics are not entirely in common, but their environments are. From studies like this, we can estimate heritability. Heritability is the degree to which variations in the trait stems from genetic differences among individuals. So how much of the variability in the trait like intelligence is due to your genetic inheritance? Most estimates agree that this is about 50% heritability for the general population, so pretty strong influence. The environment, of course, is the degree to which variation is due to environmental differences, right? Things that are different about your environment. What kind of resources do you have? What kind of schools are you able to attend? How stable is your home environment? Things like that. So intelligence testing is good at comparing people within groups, so people who have similar environments, but it's bad at comparing people from different groups, so people who grow up in different environments. Unless, of course, the environments are virtually identical. A lot of the problems that come from intelligence testing come from overestimating the ability to compare groups that are fundamentally different on a standardized score. We'll talk about exactly why that's the case. So one of the best metaphors for why we can't compare groups that are basically different is the seed metaphor, right? If you take a bag full of seeds and you're curious which of the seeds are going to grow the tallest plants, and you plant them in two different types of soil. So let's say we see here that the corn plants in pot A grow a bit taller than the corn plants in pot B. That's because we have rich soil full of nutrients over here in pot A, and in pot B we have poor rocky soil that is not very friendly to life. Because the two environments are very different, no conclusions can be drawn about the overall genetic differences between the plants in pot A and the plants in pot B. Right? It's not a fair comparison to say this plant right here should be compared to this plant right here as a measure of which is the superior seed. There's too many differences, right? They're in completely different environments, and it's not really a fair comparison. What we can do, though, is compare the average height between groups, right? We can say plants in pot A are generally taller than plants in pot B, despite being the same type of plant. This is because pot A is a better environment to grow corn in, right? So we can say that, but we can't say anything else. Okay, let's talk about this genes by environment interaction in a little bit different of a way. Let's say we've got a seed, and that seed is going to grow into a tree. And that tree has a potential to be between this height and that height, depending on what sort of care it's given, right? This is the range that that tree can express the variable of height. So let's say we have some seeds, and we plant them in rocky soil, or we plant them in this nutrient-rich soil. And then we wait for them to grow. Well, we can tell a couple of things just by sort of looking at our data, right? Or our examples here. Trees in the nutrient-rich soil, on average, grow to be taller than those that are in the harsher, rockier soil, right? So a greater number of these seeds are reaching the higher end of their growth spectrum versus those in the rocky soil who are towards the lower end. Importantly, this says little to nothing about the quality of the seeds themselves and everything about the quality of the environment. Let's look at what we're able to compare and what we can't. So we can say here that the differences in height between these two trees is due to genetic differences, right? They are in a similar environment and they are different. So that suggests a genetic component. Likewise, we can see the same about these trees over here. What we cannot do is say that this seed is different than this one. There are too many confounding factors, right? They're in a completely different environment. They were not exposed to the same factors. That means that we cannot infer anything about the genetic differences between these two seeds. What we can say, though, is that the nutrient-rich soil seems to be a better place to grow trees than the rocky soil, right? There, we can take the average height of the tree here and compare it with the average height of the tree here and say that those differences are due to the environment. So that's one piece of the puzzle with the problem of trying to compare different groups on a standardized scale. It doesn't take into account everything. And because of that, people have made the mistake of drawing conclusions about the essence of groups that are not fair or appropriate conclusions to make. But that's not all of it. Let's talk about other factors. So let's talk a bit about cultural influences. Tests reflect the culture in which they are developed. That's just sort of a part and parcel with writing a test. It's going to contain cultural artifacts of the place that it was developed. Beyond that, cultural factors can influence test-taking behavior. This can mean any number of things. It can be attitudes about tests or the people who are administering them, familiarity with taking tests, or the content on the tests itself. So an example that your book uses is the population of Japanese known as Barakumin. These people, you can see here, this is a historical photo and this is a modern day photo. These are not racially different from other Japanese people, but they have suffered from generations of discrimination. They're basically a population of people who do work that is considered to be unclean. Things like working with dead animals, tanning hides, sanitation work, that sort of thing. While discrimination against them is not legal anymore, these people suffer from generations of discrimination. And among this group, the average IQ is approximately 10 to 15 points lower than those of mainstream Japanese. Now that's a complicated situation, and there's not just one factor determining that point, right? Discrimination means differences in access to all kinds of things, as well as bringing a lot of stuff to taking a test like that in the first place. So things are better for this population of people, as discrimination is technically illegal now, but they remain the poorest group in Japan, and widespread discrimination still exists in terms of employment, marriage, and other areas. So environmental factors don't end there. They actually also make it into the test itself. As I mentioned earlier, tests are culturally bound things. And biased testing is a real problem. Luckily, testing authorities are doing their best to combat this, but it's something that keeps popping. So, standardized intelligence tests may reflect white middle-class cultural knowledge and values. Minority group members may do poorly on these tests not because of lower intelligence, but because of unfairly being expected to be familiar with the white middle-class culture. So one famous example, I believe, from the SAT is no longer part of it, but this was a question that was asked for some time. The analogy question, so runner is to marathon is to what, right? Envoy is to embassy, martyr is to massacre, oarsman is to regatta, and horse is to stable. The correct answer to this is C, oarsman as to regatta. But if you are a person who has never, had anything to do with a boat race, you might not know what that word means, or you might not understand the relationship between a person who rows a boat and some kind of a boat race. So this alienates and makes it difficult for people who are not from cultures where people race boats for fun, which is a lot of cultures. So not a great question, and these sort of things pop up all the time. It is virtually impossible to design a test that is completely culture-free, but questions can be asked that minimize the impact of that. So beyond the bias of the actual test questions, the test itself can bring out several cultural factors, such as motivation. So if you're part of a particular subgroup that is not interested in doing well on a test or doesn't value that sort of thing, attitudes towards test taking, so values towards the actual idea of taking a test for the purpose of IQ assessment varies by culture, and previous experience with tests. If you come from a part of the world where you are tested frequently and are used to doing something like sitting in a room and not moving and filling out bubbles for 3 hours, then when it comes time for you to take a test later, you're much more used to that. If this sort of thing isn't part of your cultural experience, you might find it very overwhelming to take such a long test. So there's a lot of factors at play here. All right, that is it for our discussion of intelligence. That wraps up our whole unit on thinking language and intelligence. So actually, it wraps up our content for the class. We're not covering anything else. So you've all been wonderful. Thank you for hanging out and learning with me about all of this stuff, despite the circumstances. All right, that's it. I'll see you around.